ready? You got me running. Shake it. I am Meredith Hirsh, and this is Working Healthcare, a podcast where we speak with the people transforming healthcare across medicine, education, and the systems in between. In our last episode, Dr. Wendy Dean helped us reframe a national crisis. What we often label as physician burnout, she clarified as something much deeper: moral injury. The emotional and ethical distress that happens when clinicians can't uphold the values they swore to live by. But what if this crisis doesn't stop in the exam room? What if it's trickling down and breaking our children? Today, we take that conversation one step further. The physician shortage isn't just leaving ERs understaffed. It's leaving classrooms unsupported and millions of young people unseen. As of 2024, over 160 million Americans live in mental health provider shortage areas. Even more alarming, 1 in 3 children with mental health disorders in the U.S. receives the care they need. And for child and adolescent psychiatry, there are fewer than 1 child psychiatrist for every 10,000 children, and that number keeps shrinking. This isn't just a gap in care. It's a full-blown access crisis that leaves schools overwhelmed, families struggling, and a generation of kids growing up without the support they need. Our education system is cracking under the weight of these unmet needs. School psychologists and guidance counselors are overwhelmed. Administrators are strapped for resources. And too often, kids who need compassion are instead met with disciplinary action or indifference. That's where today's guest comes in. Ali Kaufman is not a physician, but she's a first responder of another kind. As the founder and CEO of Space of Mind and the visionary behind the Community Classroom Project, Ali has spent nearly 2 decades designing mental health-centered learning environments that meet students where they are, emotionally, academically, and creatively. Long before COVID pushed kids to the edge, Ali was building new blueprints for what school could be. She knows firsthand the toll our broken systems take on young minds and why the future of healthcare may very well start in the classroom. As someone who trains educators to think like therapists and helps families navigate crises that shouldn't exist in the first place, she brings an urgent perspective to this conversation. We'll talk about how the physician deficit and the larger moral injury at play shows up in kids' behavior, families' breakdowns, and a school system that was never designed to handle any of it. And we'll ask, what does it really look like to build schools that heal? Ali, welcome to Working Healthcare.
Thank you. You said you were going to cry reading that. I just cried.
I know.
Hearing you read that. Thank you.
It was so emotional for me because you and I have known each other for a long time. You are actually one of my angels, and I do consider you one of my family angels, and I'm not going to cry when I talk about this. But you were an incredible support, especially for my son when the COVID pandemic hit in the early days and boarding schools shut down, and I didn't know where to turn. So what you do to authentically help so many young people and work tirelessly behind the scenes is so truly unbelievable. What I really want to understand is what inspired you to do all of this.
It needed to be done. I was working in family living rooms and kitchens and messy kids' bedrooms, helping families to organize the clutter and understand the family dynamics that were behind the broken systems, like organizational systems, and coaching around the things that make up that clutter in a family's household. And
how did you even get involved in that? I know that I believe you went to Dartmouth for school.
I went to Brandeis.
Or Brandeis, sorry, the other Ivy League over there.
I went to Brandeis. I wanted to be a rabbi. I got there and realized that that religion wasn't my path, but interestingly, the aspects of what I loved about Judaism, the self-discovery, the demand that you ask questions, the sense of community, the sense of purpose, all of that was part of my DNA always. So I went through a traumatic incident at school, actually right before I graduated, and really went through this journey of my own post-traumatic stress, of the collision of attending my first therapy session to discuss what I thought I was there for, which was the sexual assault. And what we ended up discussing for a year and a half was my undiagnosed ADHD and my entire family's, and how that impacted our family system. I went on this journey of self-discovery. I was 21 and was working in the restaurant industry and working on myself, and it was amazing. So coming from that place of really like seeking to understand my brain, and why was I, in the 80s, they took all the kids with really busy brains and they put us in the gifted program.
Yes.
Right? Like
yes,
now they give you Adderall and therapy, but we were taught we were smart, and we were taught leadership skills. In third grade, I learned how to run a think tank meeting. Those executive functioning skills that I learned early through the creative lens stuck with me. So when I went through this like dark period, I wasn't freaking out. I wasn't a victim. I was just using my tools to figure out what this was supposed to teach me and what's the pathway that comes out of understanding your mental health. It wasn't just because I went through this trauma. The last day of a year and a half of therapy, she was my therapist, who was amazing. She was like, so we have 15 minutes left. Today's your last day. What do you want to talk about? I'm like, today's my last day. What do you mean? And I could sit here for years with you.
Yeah, I didn't know anybody really graduated therapy.
I graduated therapy. That's how I knew she was the right therapist. And so I was like, wait, we only have 15 minutes left. And that's when I kind of went through the list, and I realized in a year and a half, we never talked about the sexual assault. The real injury that we had to deal with was, why in my brain was I able to do something so easily, and some things were easier for others and harder for me. All of these things that came with growing up in a house where we were all like yelling over each other and moving in a million directions. And my brain lives in this blender. It goes very fast. And so there are a lot of benefits to that, right? Superpowers, in fact. And then there's a lot of like chaos that can come with that too. And so I learned early on that I could create systems for managing the chaos and play games with my brain. Even as a kid, like I could clean my room in 5 minutes for the cleaning women, right? But I kept it messy because it drove my mother crazy. But so I just understood early and always that there were things about how the brain could function that were dependent on speed, but also chaos and clutter.
So what inspired you, though, to start Space of Mind? Why that organization?
I knew I wanted to have a business before I was 29. So I was always kind of thinking, or before I was 30 rather, and I started when I was 29. I was always thinking of what that could be. I had been, at the time I kind of figured it out, I was up in Cambridge and I had taken a summer off to create a business plan to start a designer clothing consignment shop for women and use this. I had been running one in Harvard Square for a while, and I realized I could get more clothes into the store if I was in everyone's closets. And that's really how I learned how to coach. Life coaching, and Brene Brown had just hit the scene, right? Tony, this was like 2000 and 2002. And I realized that what I was doing was really not about getting clothes into the store. It was helping my clients make faster, better decisions based on what they really knew they needed. And so it was a discussion. It was a discussion about inattention, disorganization, and anxiety.
But those are adults. So how
those
did you
were
get
adults, and then
kids?
Eventually, I started, my adult clients started bringing me in to work with their families. And that's when I would come in and I would help change how everyone's cooking dinner together. What happens in those hours after school and before bed, and when there's chaos, and how does everyone respond? And I was learning just as much as I was coaching, right? So I was understanding that parent who is a verbal processor is trying to communicate with their kid who's a visual processor or a kinesthetic processor, and that kid might be playing a video game. There's no way that that child's processing style will allow them to hear the verbal request that the mother is making. Hey, can you take out the trash? They're hearing it maybe and responding or barely responding, but they're not processing it because they're not verbal learners. And I was looking at all the ways that families were just breaking down in their communication and just their ability to get along, right? Like homework time is where all the horrible things can go wrong. And it was because they didn't know how to listen to each other. They didn't know how to communicate. So I would go in and create like a command center in the kitchen so that, you know, everyone would understand how they processed information best. But then there was like this place that, you know, you could go to consult the calendar, the things that you needed. And it was organized, not Martha Stewart style, like organized isn't what it looks like. It should be what it feels like.
It's also a method, right? It provides a method and a routine and a way, because a lot of these kids also need routine for, right, the frontal lobe, for the executive functioning skills. Yeah. So what brought you from Cambridge back down to Boca Raton, Florida? Because you are from this area.
I know. And I never thought I would come back ever. You know, my family brought me back. My dad was sick. My grandmothers were sick. It was just time to come home and be with my family. And at the time, I thought I was coming back down here to open the business I was running up there, which was like consignment and organizing. And where better than this place where there was no consignment culture and lots of great, fabulous clothes and women who were buying too many of them. So, but then I realized quickly that my ideal client was dealing with bigger problems than what to wear. Not that it wasn't the same conversation. It absolutely was, right? Inattention, disorganization, and anxiety. Those are the things that come up in every conversation around what you're doing or what you're learning.
So get me into space of mind.
Yeah.
How long ago did it start? How did you even decide to start this business? You really are not traditionally in the medical field, and you're providing mental health services. So how did you even get started in this? And then how is space of mind different from traditional schools?
Okay, so I grew up with this do now, apologize later leadership style.
I think we all did, for Gen Xers, because we were forced to be on our own.
Yes, and I know how to get things done, and my initials are ASK, so I'm naturally really curious of how things work. And so I had started the company, and it was really coaching. My first few clients were, this was 2004, my first few clients were hoarders, like really severe hoarders, and CEOs. And so I was realizing I was having the same conversation in both places. The CEOs started to invite me into their homes. I was already in the hoarding homes, but their therapists had no idea what their living spaces look like. And in the office where the executive was working, there was no continuity about the family system. The office might have been working on a system, but typically I was working with the dad. And I noticed quickly that the dads were not integrated into the family's system. And I come from a business background, so I understand that if you operate your household like a business, you can, like, a lot of things are just more manageable.
Yes, you can ask my 3 children.
Right, I have no doubt. So I was working, you know, with these kind of 2 groups of clients, and then the women in their closets. So I guess 3 groups. And as soon as I started working with the kids, I recognized this was the problem nobody was solving. Hoarders was a show on TV. What you see on TV is not what you should do, though, in real life. But that was already like being understood and worked on. And the CEOs, like, they would be fine, but nobody was dealing with school related stress. And when I started to go into the homes, I noticed a few really important things. Number one, I would go in on like a Saturday morning and I would get the dad on the couch with everybody. We'd sit in the living room or the family room or around the dining room table, and we just talk. I wasn't a therapist. What was a coach? Nobody really understood what that was. I was just someone coming over to talk about this really painful problem, which wasn't just homework. It wasn't just the messy bedroom. Although 99% of the time I was called for the problems that were perceived to be started by the children, what it really came down to is it was a system foundation problem, right? So I would get the whole buy-in of the family, and I would go into schools and I would, deal with the backpack black hole of, what comes out of your binders and your planner, and try to, help create systems. But I was frustrated because we would hit new levels of success in the home environment, and then you go to an IEP meeting and it was hard to get buy-in or even real like attention to what was working at home. There was no mechanism in the system to introduce new things. And so even if we came up with a system that really worked for this kid, there was no way it was going to work in a classroom.
When you were doing this in 2004, 2005, was there anybody else in this arena that was doing what you were doing?
Well, there were educational advocates, of course, who were like going in and representing a family in an IEP meeting. Yeah, but that's a little bit
different. That's an IEP meeting.
Right, no, there was nobody doing this. I was not a traditional organizer, although like the National Association of Professional Organizers was big then, like that whole, because of hoarders, there was an organizing, right? I didn't work that way. I didn't touch anybody's stuff. It was always just a conversation, right? Like it was coaching based. So no, there was, and I would say still there's not anybody who's really approaching the intersection, like you were saying, about education and mental health and a purposeful life, right? Like it's always about getting to that. And the through line, since I'm a kid, I've understood this, is creativity. The through line is finding your passion and then creating a way of showing up for it every day, right? So you were saying rituals and systems and structure is really powerful and really good, and it serves its purpose. But sometimes the ritual is to throw out the structure and know how to be comfortable in both places.
Or sometimes the structure isn't working.
Right. And you've got to just trial and error until you get there.
So what year did you open up Space of Mind?
So I started the company in 2004, and then I had let go of all of my clients who were not students and families by 2008. And then I opened the schoolhouse with 3 of my private coaching clients in my living room in September of 2010.
And the kids graduate with a degree, a homeschooling degree.
Yeah. So technically we were doing we were the micro school or the homeschool pod long before COVID popularized that. The only people homeschooling at the time were religious-based homeschoolers. There was no homeschool movement. There was no micro school term or movement. I'm a rule breaker, and I saw what wasn't working for my coaching clients. I toured in between 2008, 2009, about 25 private schools in 4 counties down here, trying to see what everybody else was doing, because I had clients that were really smart, creative, amazing kids that just didn't want to go to school. And this was also the really early days of school refusal.
Or the school didn't want the kid.
Or the school didn't want the kid.
And that's where the challenge is. I find that if private schools, because they can just wipe their hands of it and they don't want to deal with anything outside of the quote norm, that if you end up going to a private school, they're like, no, well, we're not going to deal outside of the norm. And even if they say they will, they really won't. And so I have found, my oldest is almost 25, so I've been through this childhood situation for a long time. And I found that people who really needed the support were going to the public school system. And then the public school system was strapped because they didn't have enough support or enough help for anybody. And then you're in a catch-22. And even if you had a ton of money to spend, there were no resources.
Yeah.
Nobody was around.
Yeah.
There weren't people who were doing what you were doing.
Yeah.
And so when did you have your first graduating class in Space of Mind?
So that was 2013 was our first graduating class, I believe. And yeah, we started with 3 kids in my living room. By the end of that first year, we had moved into the oldest building in Delray, which is built in 1896. And we had 8 kids on the day we moved in, and we started the following year with 16. So we grew really quickly and organically. Like, this was before zoning. Like, I couldn't go before the zoning board in Delray and say, I'm going to put a bunch of kids in this downtown, right? Like, we had to be very kind of careful in how we did it in the beginning. We are fully legal now, not to worry. But in the early years, we were a tutoring center for homeschoolers.
Yeah.
Right? Like, now we are zoned and inspected as a school. But our kids don't fall under the compliance of being at a school, and they get a lot of benefits being homeschoolers.
And describe that to me, and describe it to our listeners. I have a better understanding because I actually toured your school, gosh, I think 11 years ago.
Yeah, it was long before.
So it had to be long before where you're at now. And then I was like, I don't know, this is so different. It was so outside of my realm of understanding. It scared me.
Yeah.
But I knew I needed something. So come full circle, and COVID happens, and there's utter chaos, and it's where I end up anyway. So, and I didn't even know my son would graduate with a homeschool degree. I'm like, wait, he doesn't get homeschooled. So describe to those listening, why is Space of Mind different from a traditional homeschool? And I also ask that because I've seen a huge trend right now with homeschooling. Very educated people are homeschooling their kids. I have met 2 doctors in the last month alone where their spouse is literally homeschooling their kid. I'm like, really? You're going to teach your kid all of those subjects? They're like, no, that's not what we do. There are resources. We go out to another location. I'm like, oh yeah, like Space of Mind.
Yeah, we were doing it before anyone else was doing this. And you asked earlier kind of what prompted me to start this, or the way you asked it, the word permissionless popped into my mind. And I think the fact that I just saw this need, and I knew other programs were not doing it, and I just didn't wait to ask anyone. I just did it, and I found this way to do it. I was asked recently on another podcast if, now that there is such this micro school industry, would it have been easier or more preferred for me to have started Space of Mind now versus the schoolhouse in 2010? And it was such a quick, easy answer that it was so much easier, actually, even though it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I also still wouldn't recommend people start schools unless they really, really know what they're getting into. But it was so much easier because I'm very competitive by nature. So I just could do what I knew needed to be done. I wasn't worried about how other people were doing it. It didn't matter. I just knew that, self-discovery was at the root of it. And that if you kids are born knowing how they operate. Their bodies and brains already function at the root level the way they were designed to. What we do is we accidentally teach them not to listen to that. And we do that literally by accident. Like, a mom will come in and clean up a child's playroom or bedroom thinking it'll just get you out of the house faster. But what they're doing is they're taking away the earliest opportunity for a child to make decisions. Well, how do I want to organize my blocks? Do I want to put it by color? Do I want to do it by shape? Do I care if the blocks and the dolls are in the same thing? Ultimately, my mom never cared. Just get it off the floor before our housekeeper came. And because I could clean my room differently every time, I could make it a game. I didn't mind doing it when I had to. Where we've lost it with so many kids is we've taken that creativity, any element of making something horrible fun out of it. And we said, you have to do it this way. You have to clean your room this way. It has to go in these bins. It has to go, I've labeled them for you. So you don't even have to, this is what you have to do. Well, that's boring. And so if you have a busy brain and you need novelty in order to stay functional, then you've just been taught cleaning your room sucks.
So how do you teach kids the basic subjects of science and math and English and social studies? Because I thought Space of Mind was similar to a Montessori, the Montessoris of the 80s when I actually went in third grade. And I know that I loved math and I did not like English. And I spent all my time doing math and coloring and doing these things and theatrical stuff. And when it came to reading, I was like, no. So when I moved and my mother had to put me in a regular school, I was far advanced in math and I was in like rudimentary reading. So how do you make sure that the kids still do their academics?
So one is one part of the answer is rooted in our paradigm, which is that it shouldn't matter how you get there as long as you get there and the journey is joyful and purposeful and that you've
But you still have to do math, Ali.
Yeah, of course. It's all in there, right? So like you're getting from A to B all the core subjects, all the standards for the, enrichment subjects, right? Electives, creatives, life skills, fitness, wellness. We are a standards-based program. So while the homeschooling and microschooling movement right now is moving away from standards and iterative education, really, because we're not going to be tracking what a student's learned and what levels they're at, and if they need remediation. This movement right now is also creating a lot of space for us to miss things. And so we are incorporating the standards for the grade level that a student is ready to learn at, right? Like you just said it, most kids are not going to be at the same grade level across all their core subjects. It's more common to be better in one thing than the other. So who cares if you're at the same exact level as everybody else? We're taught that that's important because when you're making a fourth grade class with a big enough group of students, you group everybody by how old they are. But in our program, we have a wider berth to do that, like Montessori, right? We have larger house groups where most kids are wired to to build relationships easier, rather, with kids who are older or younger than them. The social pressure is different. So there's a lot of benefits to being in a mixed age group for learning, but also it doesn't stigmatize the remedial learners and it doesn't boost the ego of the higher level learners who maybe are higher level in English, but not in math, but then they now develop that like ego self-esteem differential. So there's still standards in what we do, but we operate more as a gifted program. It's a project-based learning approach. The kids actually create their curriculum through the lens of what they're excited by. Some of our kids are already really passionate about one thing or two things. So if they, one of our kids started a podcast. Two of our kids actually started a podcast.
I know, and I just learned that you have a podcast and you just wrapped your second season.
Yeah, I know.
I was like, wait, how did I not know that?
We've been kind of still quiet. We'll get better. But when you love something, you're going to dive all in. And then when you have to do something you don't love, you have the confidence that you can do it because you've had all the success in this other area. So we're still teaching math. We teach math in two different ways. We teach it through the creative lens, right? So math through music or through cooking or engineering or sports or art. Those are all ways to teach math. They're better, in fact, because we can understand the real world application. We also, math is is treated a little bit separately than the other subjects in that we're able to offer some one-on-one just calculation support, right? Like sometimes you just got to sit with the problem.
Right.
And so we do both for math, but everything is integrated in our curriculum. And so we're teaching the science and the history of the period we're reading about right. So every year we have a new theme for our curriculum. This coming year, it's a modern renaissance. And every quest, which is the, semester, the students are designing their own kind of choose your own adventure of learning. And they're doing it based on the standards that they need to hit. And we're tracking based on the growth that they're having.
Sort of like International Baccalaureate, they combine the 4 different core subjects. They're working toward one goal at the end of the year, except this is less structured, right? You don't have the exams that you have to do for IB. You don't have all of that. And it's much smaller one-on-one and meeting the kids where they need. I want to get into your classroom community project because that's pretty new. When did you have an aha moment about that? Because now you're looking even beyond the high schoolers and you're saying, okay.
Yeah, so the Community Classroom Project, we started as a 501c3 nonprofit in 2017. We had just gotten off the ground with a working board and a big fundraiser in January of 2020, and then COVID hit.
Great timing.
So we're back in business with an amazing board, and we've got a pretty cool vibe happening. So Community Classroom Project is our nonprofit organization that shares our campus, and we are on a mission to reduce learning-related stress through creativity for everyone. So we have adult programs and family programs, and we have a residential program for young adults that need to learn how to launch into adulthood. We've got a commercial teaching kitchen and culinary entrepreneurship, and yes, I host a podcast with one of my besties, Chef Blake Malatesta, called Herd Mentality, HEARD, which is a kitchen callback.
Where do you see this podcast?
So on all the places.
You can see it, Spotify,
it's
Apple
herdmentalitypodcast.com.
Okay, cool.
And we talk about the impact of mental health on our restaurant kitchen teams and families in their own kitchens. And Blake and I launched the Community Classroom Kitchen Initiative, which is part of the larger nonprofit, during COVID. And we launched a meal box project, which is coming back online this fall as one of 3 culinary entrepreneurship projects that our kids have through the nonprofit.
Which is super cool because one of Dalton's close friends from high school is a chef, and Dalton is studying winemaking, and I know that he used to bring you in a bunch of goodies because he was always baking, and it gave him an opportunity to use that outlet. And obviously you have to learn conversion, right? When you're baking and you're cooking and you're doing all of that. You just had a big event, a fundraiser, where you had one former student creating all of the food, and
Dalton's wine.
I know, Dalton served up wine, and one of his wines was everyone's favorite, so that was very special for him. And he really grew with a strong sense of confidence and even gaining friendships through the program just because the kids were given those special outlets or people who were trained to help when kids struggled. And that's the truth.
And all kids struggle. Find me an adult right now that is not on the struggle bus.
We're all struggling.
We are all on the bus. So all kids struggle. And I think what makes our secret sauce so powerful is something that shouldn't be a secret. We just come as you are. Mm-hmm. We just meet everyone where they are.
Well, you said Brene Brown. She's all about authenticity.
Yeah, that's it. Just be you.
Be vulnerable. Be authentic.
That's it. So you say vulnerable, and that's a really important word in our campus culture, because we are modeling as coaches how we want our kids and to go home and be a part of their families, right? So when you work together with a team that is modeling something so personal, you have to show up at work and also practice the skills, right? So for us to practice our craft, we have to be able to be vulnerable with each other. And that has created this beautiful opportunity for us as a working team. Similarly, I said it just the other day in our first planning meeting for this coming year, this week, that we operate like a school of fish, like like an ER team would when you're dealing with a trauma. That there is in education, whether you're working with one student or 25 in a room, it doesn't matter. There's still going to be high pressure chaos, and it could be quiet or it could be loud and ridiculous, but it's there. And the role of a coach at Space of Mind is to show up next to our student, not in front of them, not behind them, forcing them to be more advanced than they are, but right next to them wherever they are, and accept them as whoever they are. And when that barrier to entry for a child is gone, they will show up every day. They will show up with green snot in their nose, and then we have to send them home.
How have you seen the mental health support or crisis change in the school system and impact kids over the last 20 years since you've been doing this?
So I started really understanding what this schoolhouse needed to be in 2008. And 2009. And at the time, school refusal was just starting to appear. And it was caused by Edline, which was like the software that most schools use to like report grades. And not every teacher updated it at the same time. So the first conversation in the morning would be the mom who would just check the computer, accusing the child of something wrong. Maybe the kid was telling the truth. I did turn it in. The grade's just not up yet, but kids are perceived to be liars and educators were perceived to be the authority. And so I would see a lot of family breakdowns just from that software, just from daily grade reporting. When we were in school, you got a progress report that was handwritten, and then you got a report card. And that was it. Maybe my mom ran into my teacher at Publix, and once a year she would go to back to school night. Right. There was no constant reporting and parents hitting refresh to see what what was missing.
But I think that aligns even with what we deal with on the physician side. There's so much reporting. The more reporting you have, the more you drag down, like you can't even function. When I ask, and I'll ask you the same question, and I know you know the question at the end of this podcast about one change you want in our healthcare system, I will tell you, hands down, 20% say, let doctors be doctors.
Well, yeah.
And I would say the same thing, like, let kids be kids, right, Ali?
Yeah. And let's let educators be educators.
Yes.
So the second thing that got me to really understand what we needed was the emergence of a website called FormSpring. And it was around the time MySpace was still hot, right? We were pre-Facebook, pretty much 2008. And FormSpring was an early website that allowed anyone to post an anonymous question, and the answers were also anonymous. So it was the earliest form of true online bullying.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. I was like, oh, this does not sound good.
Yeah, so FormSpring and so technology, right? Both of these reasons were rooted in technology. This was when I really started to see, I was no longer getting phone calls for my kid can't keep their bedroom neat or get their homework done. It was like, my child has pitched a tent on her bed and has locked us out of her bedroom and will not go take the FSA test today, right? It was real, like urgent, therapeutic, right? Clinically necessary type of situations.
Were schools doing anything?
So no. And also the problem was therapists didn't know how to do anything. So I was having lunch and coffee and sitting down with and getting on the phone with every therapist with every family I worked with. And if they didn't have them and they needed them, I was able to make that connection. But the the reality is that I was told a lot of the time that I was teaching the therapists things because they don't have the vantage point of being in the home. Mm-hmm. And the family or the person who's going to therapy is not bringing everything that's truly relevant by design sometimes, right? Or just accidentally didn't even think it might be relevant. And so until you get into the scene, right, and you see literally what the clutter is, and clutter can be physical, but it is also mental and it is also technological, and every household and every human is dealing with all three. So that's such a core piece of how you can function as a learner or a parent, right? Anyone.
So, in your perspective, how does the physician shortage in child and adolescent psychiatry directly impact students in the classroom?
Well, I think it's directly impacting students in a number of ways. Number one, there's not enough really at all school psychologists and social workers who are truly understanding of the different ways that school anxiety and school related stress are happening. And it isn't through intention. I think it's just that there's not enough training resources and there's just not enough people going into the field. You don't get paid well and you do better in private practice. So in public school settings, and it's a lack of just bodies. In private schools, I don't think in every private school they're looking to treat non-traditional brains, right? And I say treat, but like teach, whatever. Like everyone's going to fit a certain picture. And if you have a therapist or a social worker or a life coach in that picture, what does that say about your school?
And I would say in a private school, you typically have your school nurse,
yes,
and you have your guidance counselor, but that's for educational purposes.
Correct. That's
you don't have anybody for the mental health. And it's like, oh, your kid has some learning issues. These are 3 people that we recommend that you go to. And then when you go and do a psycho-ed evaluation, you're going to be out of pocket $3,000, $4,000, and people can't afford it, and insurance doesn't cover it.
And when I would go into the house to work with a family, I would find that $4,000 30-page report in the middle of a stack of papers on that weird kitchen desk that nobody knows what to do with. And nobody was doing anything with it. And so if you get the recommendations and you've paid a lot for them, but you can't implement them, then nothing's going to change. But the issue is that mental health is not what's going on in the classroom, right? It's not what level your child is at. It's not about just the learning aspect of the brain. And when we look at what resources a school typically has, here's the testing we think you should get for your child to understand their learning approach. But the schools don't want to have information about the mental health, really, because they're liable for it, and the system's not set up to really engage a family in talking about that. And I think a lot of parents are nervous to give out too much information about the dynamic of their home or their family because they don't want to be judged or labeled or whatever. So the schools don't also have the information that they really need to know how to help a child. Like, if that child doesn't get a good sleep at night, right? If nobody's hugging them, it doesn't matter how wealthy a family is. There's plenty of, need at every level for just nurturing. Then they may not be functioning in a level where they're open to learning. Our working memory doesn't serve us when we're stressed.
Right. And I even think back to my perspective with the fact that I actually worked my first master's degree in English education. And so it wasn't traditional English where I had to read Shakespeare all of the time, although, it's so painful for me.
So painful for me, too.
It is so painful. But it was more on the educational aspect. And so I understood dyslexia a little more. I understood certain learning disorders a little bit more. And it was Ethan, my oldest, who was in 5th grade. And I'm like, this kid can't spell, like something's going on. And this is not typical. My middle one, Dalton, was getting so frustrated because I would have the spelling words for the week all over the kitchen taped. And Dalton would just go through reading them all. And then I would ask how to spell words and Dalton would just spell the word.
Yeah.
And Ethan would get upset because he didn't know how to spell the word and he didn't remember. And I'm thinking, I've gone through this 100 times. And so he's 6 years old now, and he's one of the youngest ones, and he's in first grade. And I said, he has dyslexia. And they're like, no, kids read at different ages. I go, I get that. I didn't read until I was 7 years old. I don't have dyslexia, though. I just read at 7. He has dyslexia. And it was me who kept pushing it. And I was the one who got him tested. Mm-hmm. And I went through that process. But not everybody has the background I have. And so what are we doing for our children when we have this shortage? You know, teachers are as strapped as healthcare workers. My mother-in-law, runs a charter school in Miami.
She's amazing.
And she is amazing. And I said, how long are you going to work? And she said that she was going to be like Warren Buffett and work until she's 93 and still go in every day. I said, great. But what are we doing with this shortage? How can we fix this on a grander scope?
Well, I think that we have to change the culture around mental health in a lot of ways, because I'm not a therapist, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a diagnostician. I do my best to understand how the brain works within the environment that it's in for the person whose body it is functioning in, and I do that by listening to the person. So that is really important because we aren't doing enough of that, and it doesn't have to be coming from only having enough doctors. We need more psychiatrists. We have a huge problem with not enough adolescent psychiatrists, like huge problem. And the psychiatrists need to have a longer session with their patient. And the psychiatry appointment is generally a short, hit and run. How's your dose working out for you? Well,
exactly. And that's what Dr. Wendy Dean said. She said, I'm a psychiatrist. I really believe in the integration of medicine and being able to provide therapeutic talk support.
Yeah.
And I'm getting paid like a social worker. I graduated med school and have $300,000 in debt. I can't support my practice by what these insurance companies are paying me. So in our area where there's a very high socioeconomic level, most of the psychiatrists are for cash, and people who really need them can't get them.
No.
So I really wanted to ask you, in our last episode, Dr. Wendy Dean, she described moral injury as the deep emotional and ethical distress doctors face when they can't uphold the values they committed to. And moral injury doesn't just affect doctors. And now we get into educators, right? So it can really affect any person who cannot uphold the values to which they committed. So from your experience working closely with schools and families, how does this moral injury among the adults in these children's lives trickle down to affect kids' mental health and behavior? So in a really short response, because you could talk about this.
Hard.
I know
At the end of the day, we all need to feel safe, loved, and celebrated, right? Maslow's.
I love that. Right? Yes, hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. So that is at the end of the day. And the beginning of every day is what we should be focused on. And I think that I say this to kids and parents all the time, that parents only have two emotions when it comes to their children: love and fear. Everything else is kind of BS.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Everything else is fleeting. Everything else is frustration, anger, disappointment.
But it's more the fear that they won't succeed, right? That's why we're disappointed.
That's right. But even guilt is fleeting. But guilt is the one that you're talking about with the question, right? So if parents would understand that those two emotions are the only ones that matter. And if you look at how you're responding from a place of love and fear and not the other things, then it would be easier to endure those moments and grow through them. I think the same is true for kids and educators, that everybody's moral injury goes down if we release the emotions that don't track.
So what do you think a school needs to become a healing environment?
They need to accept every student as they are.
And what do you do for those parents who think they have these perfect children?
Well, I would ask them what they think about their kids when they're alone and not telling people what they think about their kids, right? Like, nobody's perfect. That is the problem, that we've coined this term. When I was doing a lot of like real clutter coaching with very disorganized people, Martha Stewart was like, the goddess, right? The Container Store was Bloomingdale's. Like, everybody wanted to have label makers and it had to look a certain way. We have to release that. It has to feel a certain way. And if you create schools to feel a certain way, instead of look like they are a school and they are doing school things, it changes everything, right? You walked through Space of Mind just recently for this dinner. It feels a certain way. It does not feel like an institution. It does not feel like you have to conform in any way. It feels wide open to all possibilities. And it changes too. The interior changes with the flow of the program or the time or whatever, or whatever cool furniture I seem to find.
Well, I'm a big energy person.
Yeah.
And I felt your energy when I first met you. And I think that people forget to have that gut feeling and allow that to help them make decisions.
Yeah.
And I say that when one of the lectures I do is how to be a successful entrepreneur. And one of it is you got to trust your gut.
That's right.
You got to have this feeling. You have to understand the energy around you. How implementing any of this, or even parents listening to this, because it's sort of a deviation from what I typically do. However, I think there's such a correlation, because when I was listening to Wendy, I said, I have to get Ali on, because she was explaining why all of these psychiatrists are leaving and why doctors are leaving. And I'm like, but that's the problem with these children. And they're the ones growing up in this world. And what are we going to do?
Yeah.
How can people listening at home know that if they follow some of these guidelines, they decide they're keeping their kid in school, they can't find a psychiatrist or a psychologist or or any type of social worker or anybody for mental health? How do they know that what they're doing is actually making positive outcomes?
Is your child getting out of bed happy? Like, really, like, that's ultimately... Happy comes from that sense of purpose and feeling fulfilled, right? It's the pathway to learning, but happy is hard to achieve these days. And that should be the goal. There also needs to be educational goals, right? Like, I say that in this moment where we are becoming unschoolers by trend in a lot of ways, right? That, it's more of a hybrid schooling situation that's coming up right now. And there still needs to be an ability to teach kids to be informed, critical thinkers. And
I think that's what we're losing, actually. And my mom will say that as a social worker. She'll say, because you don't go into the library all day, you don't look at microfiche, you don't know how to use the Dewey Decimal System, you can just go on to ChatGPT, or you can go on to the internet and just search something. Everybody's lost that critical thinking skill.
Yeah. Well, it also comes from having conversations with people who will challenge you. And it comes from being in an educational environment with people who truly know and respect you, meaning the educators, right? So the Space of Mind we're in such a good place to have the continuity of care, right? Our coaches have been with us a really long time, and we get to know our kids throughout their growth process. Some kids come to us and they're a new kid in 24 hours, and other times it's 3 years, to help somebody really get to their core self, right? And we get to go on that journey. So I think a big part of it is being able to see the process and know that you can nurture it at whatever pace it goes.
So what do you wish more healthcare professionals understood about the intersections between mental health, education, and systemic challenges?
Okay, well, I mean, the short answer is that we have to listen to the kids more. They are operating at PTSD mode. All the kids still are recovering from the learning losses academically, but the social losses and emotional losses from COVID. Their families were upended. It was only 5 years ago, and it changed things. So adults have to move on because we pick up our lives, we pick up our jobs, but we forget that kids they didn't know at that time everything adults knew, right? They were young. And so we've moved on because we can and but they now have a profoundly different childhood than we did. And where we have to remember, the Common App for college admissions is still asking the essay question to talk about your COVID experience. The reason is they're still studying it, that we're still trying to understand how did that year and a half, some kids 2 years of profoundly changed exposure in a classroom environment, in a social environment, in an environment outside of your nuclear family. How many kids went through real terror to get back into a social environment or get back into a group learning environment? It's still happening. So we have to understand that kids right now are still living the symptoms of trauma, PTSD.
And we talked about the negative effects of all of this social media and tech.
Yeah,
but how
all of that too.
Oh, I know. I know. I don't think you can find anybody who's a recent college grad who actually wants to come into an office and work 40 hours a week. But how can technology be used to support mental health centered learning environments? Is there a way it could help?
I'm going to say something that's going to be a really unpopular answer. Well, two things. The first thing is access to providers who can support us and our children by really understanding what's going on, right? And really being there as a sounding board, which is, I think, the best role that a physician can be.
If you can get one.
And that's also why I think that the person prescribing the meds, it should be the one having the deep conversation. That there's stuff that we see in a classroom environment. We know who doesn't eat. We know who eats at what time. We know who can't wake up at what time. We know all the things that doctor needs to know. So we create the relationship and we have those conversations with the therapy providers. We're in collaboration with them, but most schools are not. And that's not because our kids need that. We have a profoundly different group of children than any microcosm. We're just a microcosm of any 50 kids who have today's stuff.
The ratio is much, much lower. Yeah. How can technology, though, benefit the average kid?
So access, right? Access. So access
to
your provider. My unpopular
answer
is I've ChatGPT.
Okay. I don't think it's unpopular. I sort of love ChatGPT.
Well, it's not in replacement of, right, somebody that's truly able to make sure that you have a real window on your mental health, but you can train your GPT to be a coach. And you can also train it to access different modalities of treatment in how it's coaching you, right? Coach me using the DBT skills to work out the social problem I'm having with my friend. Here's the problem, right? There are role-playing scenarios that you can create now in ChatGPT and coaching conversations that I think can help. And this generation is already using it in a lot of ways that isn't unsimilar. I don't know that they're thinking about it in terms of mental health, but there's some really cool things that you can do that we're playing with, and I think that will help.
It's going to change the world. It's like man finding fire.
It's really crazy. I mean, if the power goes out, we're all going to be in the fetal position.
I know. I think so. Well, we'll have fire.
I don't know. This generation does not know how to make a fire. So
I'll have fire. At least we'll have fire for a little bit. I was part of the one match club.
The last thing I would say to answer that question is we have to change the way we think about the term mental health.
Oh, yes.
We have to just look at it as happiness, as joyfulness, as meaning, right? Finding meaning. It's not a clinical, if we look at it only like there's something wrong with you, if you say mental health or that only people who have something wrong with them should work on it, then we have missed that completely. And I think that is something that that can change in a school easily.
Or even saying that you have to work on it, right?
Yeah,
we live this way. This is who we are.
We're all really like a mess.
We all have something going on.
Yes.
Okay. So if people want to pretend they don't, the truth is if you dig deep enough, you went into people's homes, you know.
Yep.
So to wrap this up, Ali Kaufman, if you could create one change within our American healthcare system, what would it be?
You know, I was thinking about this on my way over, and I think that ultimately it would be the last thing I said, that it is not something that we look at as a medical component of our lives, but it's something that we look at as a component of our lives, and that we can have vulnerable, honest conversations where with educators and parents and kids all together, but also that we take the stigma out of you have to have letters behind your name to talk about it with somebody, that we can train educators and youth work, youth program, leaders and clergy, and right, to have these conversations that need to be had and to help kids find a voice to open, right, the door to what they need to talk about. Every kid right now has got stuff that they need to talk about.
Ali Kaufman, thank you for joining me on Working Healthcare.
Thank you.
This is by far my favorite.
Ooh.
I know. I feel like anyone really listening is going to be like, what happened to mine? But I adore you. And thank you for sharing your inspiring perspective and solutions to help our next generation navigate a healthcare system deeply affected by mental health and the physician shortage crisis, which I talk about every week.
Yep. Thank you.
Too often people don't realize how these shortages don't just impact patients today, they create a ripple effect that touches families, schools, and communities, as you explained, and shaping the health and well-being of our children and our young people is so vital. So thanks, Ali.
Thank you.
To everyone listening, the full video of this episode is now available on YouTube. Just search Working Healthcare and hit subscribe so you don't miss future interviews, short clips, and behind-the-scenes moments. If you have a question, an episode idea, or somebody you think I should feature, please reach out at meredithhirsh.com. New episodes drop every Tuesday, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. I am Meredith Hirsh. Tune in weekly as we explore the inner workings of healthcare. You ready? You got me running, got me running.